If someone tried to tell you that a game based on being a park ranger of sorts could be one of the most engrossing and satisfying story driven games you've ever played, you would look at them as if they had grown another head, right? I even thought the very same thing when I first heard about the game Firewatch. I thought to myself, what fun could that be? Isn't that just one of those games that everyone basically calls a walking simulator? I mean, it looks good and everything, but I don't know. These are some of the things that ran through my head until I decided to do some research of my own into the game before I decided to plunk down my own money to play this. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but I do quite a bit of research before I decide to play a game. The only real exception to this rule is when I take the chance on my horror game videos that I do. It may sound like a bit too much just to buy and play a game, but 2 points there. One, I have yet to feel like I've spent too much money on a game, and two, I've never really been disappointed in something that I've actually purchased. After doing said research on Firewatch, I finally decided to make the leap and go ahead with this title. Granted, when I do buy my games, I tend to look for as much replay value as is possible, because I really don't enjoy short games, as I've said before in my Arcane Dimensions video, but Firewatch really changed my mind on a lot of different preconceived notions that I had about the ideas that I had in my head about games and how storytelling works. The story starts off, as a lot of stories do, meeting someone in a bar in your 20s, flirting, getting together, eventually living together, and all of the stuff that comes along with starting a new exciting chapter in your life. You sort of play a part in the backstory, which builds up to the actual beginning of the game, which is really some clever writing. You already know two of the most important characters and are invested in their story. The writing definitely draws on some very familiar things that most of us can all relate to. Finding someone and falling in love, getting a family pet, how sometimes people from out of town can make things much harder on you, illness, mental illness, how all of this can affect the human condition, and asking how you would respond in the same situations. It also deals with the feelings of loss and losing someone not just physically, but in a deeper way. Watching someone you love become another person. Watching them slip away from you as they slowly forget more and more who you are and even why they love you so much. Things like this is exactly what drives Henry, the game's main protagonist, to take a job fire spotting in the Wyoming Rocky Mountains. He is trying to, in essence, get a fresh start and to try to move on from the things that have seemingly destroyed his life, taken his loving wife away from him, and has wrought so much upheaval that he felt like the best thing to do was disappear into the woods for a summer. It kind of reminds me of the beginning of the Pixar movie Up. Before the plot even gets rolling, you already feel like you've been on an emotional roller coaster and wonder, if just the intro can do that to you, what's the rest of the experience going to be? Thankfully, you don't have to wait very long to find out, as the first thing you have to deal with is some teenage girls who have decided to bring a boombox and a bunch of beer to the lake. They would have gotten away with it too, but they decided to also bring fireworks and set them off, which wouldn't normally be a problem, but the fire danger in this part of the Rockies is extremely high, hence one of the reasons why you've been hired. Before I go much further into the game, I think it needs to be pointed out that this game takes place in the 80s. This needs to be said because some of the dialogue in this game is really indicative of the era, as well as some of the things that are used, such as the aforementioned boombox, which is blasting some pretty tubular 80s synthwave style music, Henry's car, some of the books, the interior of the lookout tower, and the walkie-talkies. The walkie-talkies are actually pretty important, because this is the only way for you to talk to the other main character in the game, a fellow lookout by the name of Delilah. She is also your boss, essentially, so she gives you the basic rundown on your job and things related to being a Firewatch. You meet her when you get to your lookout tower after a 2-day hike to even get in the tower, which might tell you how out in the wilderness you really are. Honestly, the rest of the plot, in a spoiler-free way, revolves around her, as none of the situations you find yourself in would exist if it weren't for her, the drunk girls being the only exception. You can immediately tell, though, that your job is pretty lonely, which is really one of the big reasons why Henry finds himself out there. This is pretty evident in the way Henry responds to Delilah at first, seemingly pretty hesitant and clearly a little resistant as well. Delilah, on the other hand, seems eager to strike up a friendship with her new lookout, which I could see spending an entire summer with nobody else to talk to can almost sound like some sort of torture, unless there's a very specific reason for doing so, much like in Henry's case. Which I can agree with too, sort of being in a somewhat similar situation without going into a whole lot of personal detail. Spending a few months alone in a tall tower with just a typewriter to sort of collect his thoughts and possibly organize them, as well as try to find out where his head is at when it comes to his wife Julia, can seem like just the way to go. It really isn't 100% clear exactly what Henry's initial plans are, if he is just trying to figure out his life, or if he is, in fact, trying to move on and start somewhere fresh, from a figurative standpoint anyway. This is one of the best parts of the writing in Firewatch. The fact that before you've really even started your adventure, you already have a sense of some sort of baggage and some kinds of invested stakes in where the main character's story arc is going. One of the hallmarks of good writing is that it definitely makes you feel things that you may be feeling at the time, or it's things you've not felt in a long time. The important part is, it triggers a specific emotion, and emotions, especially in gaming, are critical if you want the player to feel connected to the main character in any way. The best example I can give of this is Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. The writing from BioWare there is some of the best, if not the best, in any game I have ever played. Just the simple twists and turns the plot takes really ties you as a player into the story. Good writing in a game should be like binge watching a series of your favorite show on your streaming service of choice. You should want to keep playing, not for achievement hunting, although that is a good reason to also keep playing, not for some kind of completion run, but for the simple fact that you want to see exactly how the story ends. The game can really give you a lost kind of vibe at times. In fact, as far as the mystery side of the equation goes, the game can really drive you mad when all you want to find out is exactly what is going on and who is responsible for some of the things that you experience. I had a movie do that to me once, with the quality of the mysterious storytelling. It was actually a quite older movie, Spencer Tracy movie to be exact, Bad Day at Black Rock. My dad was the one who turned me on to it, and after about 45 minutes watching this movie, I was actually visibly angry that the story was simply not telling me what was going on. I would go into a lot more detail, but even though it is a considerably older movie, I really don't want to give away any spoilers, simply because of the brilliant way the plot is written, and really keeps all of the mystery and secrets under its hat, never getting too far in front of the main protagonist. Some not as good mystery stories tend to do this. It will show something to the audience who now has more information than the main character. This really puts the pace of things in a really odd position, as the person watching is a step ahead, and it instills a sense of anger, if not moderate irritation, with the progression of the media in which it is being presented. Horror movies are really notorious for this, as it will cut from the scared teenager in a room somewhere in a house back to the crazed serial killer who is shown sneaking through a window in the back kitchen door or something equally contrived, then cut back to the teenager. All the while, the audience is screaming at the screen, usually something along the lines of, "He's in the house, you dumbass, run!" Firewatch doesn't present anything to you that Henry doesn't already know. Delilah may know more than Henry, but you as the player never do. In this way, games are a much more effective medium for a presented story that requires things to be slowly uncovered. The only things that you as the player know are conveyed through the tiny walkie-talkie or through direct interaction with the environment. A great example being the creepy guy with the flashlight that Henry sees while out walking one night. Speaking of walking, Firewatch also does a magnificent job of really making sure you feel like you are stuck right in the heart of the Wyoming Rockies, albeit with a somewhat unique artistic flair. It is pretty stylized, but not to the point of being unbelievable. It almost tries to convey the feeling of being in a forest like this, or even just the memory of what some place like this sort of feels like. Living in Colorado for a majority of my life, I can relate to looking back in my mind at some of the instances where I spent a good amount of time in the mountains, and the memory of it almost looks the way the forest is depicted in the game. It also does a pretty good job of getting you in the right mindset for the era in which the game is set, before a time where most of the national parks and woods would become overly crowded, and the National Park Service was almost struggling to keep up with trying to maintain and repair the parks themselves, when the woods and mountains seem more wild before the rise of survival reality shows and other seemingly exploitative forms of media. It truly does take you as Henry on a visual journey that provides some pretty incredible scenery to accompany the summer changes, and how Henry views not only his life, but views his relationships with his ailing wife as well. Okay, before I go any further, we really need to dive into the real meat and potatoes of this plot, so I really have no choice but to talk about some pretty spoiler heavy parts of this. So if this game and story and setting really do seem like the kind of thing that appeals to you, that you would want to check out for yourself, please stop watching this video now so you can unravel the plot for yourself. I won't judge you at all, and in fact, will commend you for deciding to put the brakes on here. Do, though, come back to watch the remainder of this video once you've completed the game, and you can weigh in on your thoughts and feelings along with the rest of us. The game begins without any kind of title screen or any kind of tutorial, but rather gives you a selection of choices. It kind of gives you another feeling of nostalgia, as to me anyway. It has a feeling of older text only adventure games. There are no visuals, no cutscenes, nothing that actually shows you what is going on. Option A or Option B type of choices that really steer the way Henry reacts to situations and kind of sets up your version of the main character. It doesn't have any drastic implications on how the rest of the game plays out, but does provide a connection between the player and Henry, making you actually put some thought into how you would react to some of the earlier situations that life can throw at you. While you're making these decisions, the game keeps cutting back and forth between these choices and showing Henry going from his home to what's obviously an old Jeep Comanche truck to the trailhead where Henry then hikes to get to his lookout tower. After your rest the first night there, you get a call over your radio tower from your new boss, Delilah. She is a very seasoned lookout and is obviously used to having new people in the job and takes the time to get to know you and welcome you to the job. She kind of goes through the basics of what you will be doing for the whole summer, which is included, but not limited, to mild park ranger type activities, making sure people aren't going to burn the forest down, pick up after careless campers, and things like that. The first piece of business that you are tasked with is identifying the source of some fireworks that Delilah sees going off not too far from either one of the lookout towers. As the fire danger this particular summer is very high, doing that kind of thing is almost punishable by legal action, as Delilah has set up signs that determine exactly how high the fire danger is, much like the signs of that nature that you can still see to this day in most national forests. The incriminating, detonating evidence is traced to a couple of teenage girls who seem to have brought too much beer for either one of them to consume safely, and an old style large boombox that is playing a pretty good rendition of some, 80s style music. Henry is told to simply confiscate the fireworks and scorn the girls for doing something so very obviously foolish. They call Henry a fat old lonely guy out in the woods, which both is harsh and kind of accurate, as our hero isn't exactly a spring chicken anymore. On the way home, in the dark, Henry sees someone who is holding a flashlight and trains it on Henry for what seems like far too long without saying a single word. This is where the game begins to take on a seemingly more sinister and eerie tone. Henry then returns to his lookout tower to find that it has not only been forcibly broken into, but ransacked as well. His typewriter has been tossed out of a window and its sheets are gone. Pretty crappy thing to do to someone who's only trying to do his job and make sure a forest isn't turned to cinders by some drunken teens. At least that's who we are led to believe is behind this heinous offense. The next day, Delilah informs Henry that a very important communication line, which she uses to contact anyone outside of their area, is down and sends him to investigate to determine if it is something simple and can be repaired. Henry then finds out that the line is not down due to some storm or some simple malfunction, but in fact has been cut deliberately. There is a note, seemingly from the teen girls, written on a pair of teenage girls' underwear. At this point, it seems like this is some sort of revenge on Henry for bothering them by the lake and taking their fireworks. Both Delilah and Henry decide to try to do their best to scare the girls off outright so that both the forest is better off and, well, for their own peace of mind as well. Henry then finds the campsite of the teenage girls and discovers the site ransacked and pretty destroyed. Henry does find his sheet from the lookout tower, which seems to point to the girls being the ones who were responsible for breaking into his tower. He also finds yet another note there at the site which blames Henry for the destruction of their good time and the destruction of their things. The two can only hope, though, that the girls are now out of the picture and they can get on with their summer. After this, while on one of his walks, Henry is happy to find a backpack with quite a bit of climbing rope in it, which is very needed for some of the steeper slopes in the area and some of the more treacherous rocky areas that Henry has to traverse. The backpack also has an old school disposable camera in it, which, upon discovery, Henry accidentally takes a picture of himself, nearly blinding himself with the flash in the process. On a quick side note, I really do miss the high-pitched noise of an old flash charging back up, the kind of whine in the center of your ear, kind of like a CRT TV. To kind of stay on a side note, this camera came with a kind of cool feature when the game came out. The camera allows you to take pictures of anything you want out in the game's world. When it first launched, players would be allowed to send these pictures into Campo Santo, and then Campo Santo would send the pictures off to a pretty retro-style photo developer. I think in the game it's called Photodome. And they would send you all of your developed pictures in one of those old school style cardboard packets with the negatives in the back even. I don't think that they still do that anymore. It's worth checking out, but I think that's a pretty cool idea. Getting back to the backpack, there is a name written on it, Brian Goodwin. The name really doesn't ring any bells to Henry, but does seem to unsettle Delilah a bit. You're really not sure why, but she does a good job of playing it off. You find out through the course of normal discussion that Brian was a kid who came out there with his father, Ned, who was a lookout one summer. Delilah tells you that under normal circumstances, kids aren't allowed to be in a lookout tower or accompany their parents out there on the job. But since he was a nice kid and was honestly better to talk to than his father, she decides not to say anything. I can sympathize with Brian here, as my dad used to do the same thing with me. He would take me out on deliveries with him when he used to deliver office supplies to corporate and private offices. I was definitely not supposed to be doing that, nor was he, but his coworkers never really gave it a second thought. Brian's dad, Ned, was a Vietnam War vet with a pretty bad case of PTSD who wanted his son to engage in potentially manly pursuits, learning to survive in the woods, going rock climbing, things like that, hence the gear you find in his backpack. Brian, though, really liked to live inside his own imagination instead. He really liked the game Wizards and Wyverns, which, of course, is a spoof on Dungeons and Dragons, which made the kid, by the standards of the time, a bit of a nerd, and therefore he had a hard time making friends. This explains the attachment to Delilah. It also explains why she is obviously a little bothered by why Henry finds his backpack hung up on a tree seemingly randomly out in the wilderness. At this point, those troublesome teens are reported missing. Neither one of them knows exactly how this happened. Maybe it has something to do with the destroyed camp. Maybe that strange guy with the flashlight did this. All that Henry and Delilah know is that it's probably due to their own fault. However, though, since Henry was the last one to see the girls before they were reported missing, a decision needs to be made about what happens from here. You can either decide to cooperate and answer any questions to prove your absolute innocence in this whole matter, or decide to falsify reports and try to sweep anything that may even be the least bit incriminating under the rug. Regardless of what you decide, Delilah will falsify the reports anyway, mostly because she's the one actually submitting said reports, and I'm sure she just wants a quiet summer with the least amount of headaches as possible. This seems to be a trend with Delilah, as we will discover later. Some time passes, and Henry and Delilah are getting to know each other more and more, sometimes while Delilah drinks her bottles of booze and she cools down in a river. Kind of a cool trick, if you ask me. We rejoin our digital friends at night as Delilah wakes up Henry to tell him about a new fire that she sees. They talk a bit, more so like two old friends at this point instead of two people who were just thrown into this new job together. She prompts him to name the fire, which also has a small effect on the outcome of the game. More time passes, and it seems like these two are really starting to grow a really good bond, which makes sense since Delilah is obviously pretty lonely, not just in this job, but in life as well. And Henry, well, he really isn't in a good place emotionally, what with the things that have been going on with Julia and all. He misses who she used to be instead of what she has become. Not of any fault of her own, though, bear that in mind. We catch up with Henry as he is doing some fishing, and while he's out doing that, he discovers something quite odd. He discovers a radio and a clipboard with an entire word-for-word transcription of the conversations they've both been having via radio over the whole summer. Remember also that these two have not actually physically met yet. They've only gotten to know each other and become close over a couple of pretty cheap radios. Think of it as a precursor to slowly falling in love with someone over Facebook or over text. This really strikes Henry as being almost impossible to imagine. Why would something like this happen all the way out here? Just as he is trying to take all this in, he is very unceremoniously knocked out by an unseen assailant and wakes up after a time with the clipboard and the radio gone. Before he was knocked out, however, Henry did notice the location on the top of the sheet that the conversations were logged on and tells Delilah who is in near hysterics at this point. Understandable because from her perspective, she was told someone has been eavesdropping on him all summer. Her new lookout, who discovers this, goes completely silent on the radio for hours. I know I would be panicking by now. When he comes to, Henry calms her down as much as he can before connecting the dots with Delilah's help to pinpoint the location from where these might have come from. Henry immediately goes to the meadow on the letterhead to find a fenced-off area that looks like some kind of research or listening facility. He breaks in to find a radio hub, which at a glance looks like something that could be used in on their conversations. More documentation that seems like some sort of behavioral analysis of both Henry and Delilah, along with more of their conversations. This seemingly leads to feelings that this is not real. It seems very much like some sort of conspiracy. This leads Henry to feel like maybe Julia developing dementia was something environmental. Maybe it's affecting Henry as well. He begins to doubt his own reality, which is pretty apparent when it is shown that he has begun to use his typewriter for not writing a novel or collecting his thoughts, but trying to connect the dots and maybe uncover something more insidious. It kind of looks like that conspiracy theory meme that you see on Facebook all the time with the strings between the pictures. Jokingly, they talk about burning the place to the ground as a sort of screw you guys kind of a solution to the problem. Makes sense though, burn it down and it all goes away, right? They of course decide to not do this, as they are better people than that, but once Henry leaves the site, it's set ablaze anyway behind him, once again incriminating both Henry and Delilah. As if they didn't have enough to deal with from a legal standpoint with the teens going missing, now they have to answer questions about potentially a government site going ablaze and no one else to possibly blame for it. One good thing came from Henry's visit to the site, though, a tracking device which homes in on any kind of localized radio signal. It also doubles as a replacement for the compass, as the display will point the direction of travel for Henry, but it also begins to beep faster or slower depending upon how close to the signal Henry may be. This will come in handy as the day after Henry's visit to the site, Delilah tells Henry to go to a certain lockbox with a now different combination on it. Granted, she tells you where to go in the form of vague directions and somewhat of a riddle, involving something that only Henry can see in his lookout tower. She obviously has had enough of this being listened in on business, and has provided a new radio with a different frequency so they can get down to the bottom of this weirdness going on around them. Your newly acquired tracking device immediately comes in handy, as it leads you to another backpack that contains a key to a locked cave that Henry has passed earlier. While you are out, Delilah tells you that there's someone beside you in the tower, mistaking it for you at first, and tells you to hurry back to make sure everything is okay. Upon Henry's arrival, he discovers a tape player, taped to his door, with recorded conversations of you and Delilah not seriously discussing burning the camp down. This obviously makes the both of you pretty upset, as more and more it feels like something very weird is going on that is meant to paint the both of you as some kind of horrible criminals. Definitely the kind of thing that makes you think that you're close to uncovering some kind of a conspiracy, or you've maybe gone farther than you should have. One of those good mystery tropes. This is kind of a problem, though, since modern gaming storytelling has conditioned all of us to expect that there is something much bigger being set up in front of us, that the game and therefore the story is really building up to some kind of massive crescendo that we will experience some kind of Michael Bay film in the end, celebrated by the credits rolling, achievements popping, and the satisfaction that comes with another finished playthrough. At this point, though, the best course of action is to simply keep going with where this leads, which at this point is obviously the cave you have just found the key to. Upon entering the cave, Henry finds out that he does not have any kind of radio signal inside. See, even old school radio waves can't make it through solid rock, let alone 4G or LTE. Very soon after making this discovery, Henry hears the gate of the fence being slammed behind him, which really seems like this is getting more and more dangerous. Making his way through the cave, Henry stumbles upon a hideout that appears to have been made by Brian as an escape from the father that really did not understand him. He had all of his Wizards and Wyverns books, drawings of the fantastical place created in his mind to overlay upon this place where his dad has taken him for the summer. It's almost as if he's created his own version of a place from his imagination and really enjoyed being there as opposed to anywhere else. You can even find some more climbing gear, which Henry used to proceed further into the cave. Now, the last thing anyone would expect to find in a cave in the middle of the wilderness is a dead body, but on the ground, circled in a shaft of light, is Brian Goodwin's body, which has begun to truly decompose, which is an obvious sign he's been here a while. This is a very somber moment and truly impacts Henry. He immediately realizes that this is in fact Brian, and is just about as beside himself as I'm sure you as the player are. I know I was. It's pretty clear as to how he died, falling from trying to get better at rock climbing to appease his dad. This is truly where the plot begins to turn as things start to become even just a little more clear. If this is Brian's body, then where is his father Ned? This is something that clearly Delilah knows nothing about, as she is obviously very upset and also beside herself when Henry informs her of this discovery upon exiting the cave. She immediately places all the blame on herself, as it was in fact her who allowed Brian to stay with his dad that summer. If she had told someone about Brian, anyone, both him and his father would have been told to leave and he might still be alive. This is a pretty sizable amount of guilt that she's placed on herself, which is very understandable, as I know I would have done the same thing. Granted, it was an accident which caused him to die, but it was Delilah who decided to look the other way when it came to following the rules. This takes the focus off who has been listening in, as this is a much more important thing to deal with, and hits Delilah very close to home, as she had developed a bond with Brian and was seemingly the better choice between her and his father in his eyes through the course of the summer. The next day, both Henry and Delilah are ordered to evacuate the area, as the wildfire that you named earlier in the game has grown to the point of beyond the point of safe containment and has become a very clear and immediate danger. As you're getting your things together to leave and say goodbye to what has been a life-changing summer out here in the Wyoming woods, your tracking device begins to beep. You follow the signal, telling Delilah you're going to investigate. She tells you she will wait for you as long as she can while you hunt down the beep. You then discover a tape, which is surprisingly from Ned Goodwin. He reveals to you that it has been him all along, listening in, planting the transcripts in the government site, which it turns out was really just observing the wildlife, watching you, locking you in the key cave, and even burning down the site itself. He was also the one with the flashlight. The whole situation was really just created by Ned as a way to try to keep you from discovering the body of his now dead son. He also confirms that it was in fact a climbing accident that killed Brian, which caused Ned to create the makeshift bunker which Henry is led to while listening to Ned basically spell everything out for Henry. Ned decided that instead of going back to civilization and taking responsibility for what happened, that he would instead just stay out there, in the woods, completely isolated away from everyone and everything. It was never anything against Henry specifically, but just whomever may have gotten close to discovering Ned's secret. You find stolen things in Ned's bunker, radio equipment, supplies, as well as enough stuff that it's obvious he has been out here since that fateful summer. So that's the big reveal. It really wasn't some kind of massive cover-up. There wasn't any kind of more sinister plot that Henry was on the verge of opening up like a can of worms. It was just a failed father who decided to become a mountain man to cover up the death of his son. A lookout who felt attached to a lonely boy and decided to look the other way. And then there's Henry, a man who has seen a lot of changes in his life recently, including the loss mentally of the person he loved more than anyone and promised to spend the rest of his life with. He came out here to try to provide himself with an escape from all of that, and ended up getting involved in circumstances that were created by and really centered around his new boss. As Henry leaves Ned's bunker, he is informed by Julia that the teens are in fact not dead, but were picked up in a local town drunk and riding a stolen tractor. Probably the best bit of news that Henry has received in quite some time. This, immediately followed by one of the worst, being that Delilah has decided to go ahead and leave on the chopper that's already there waiting on her, informing you that they will come back to get you after. This means that you never get to meet the woman with whom you've shared the entire summer, albeit over a walkie-talkie. You do, however, get to go into her tower, which is some form of closure. You find the sign for Pork Pond, which is a pretty funny moment in the game, some drawings of her by Brian, and the radio headset that she's been using all summer to talk to you. You have one final conversation about where to go from here. You suggest that she come back to Boulder with you, and she suggests that, much to the dismay of many, I'm sure, that you go back and try to be with Julia. There may not be much of her faculties left, but it is the right thing to do, and will definitely provide Henry with some much-needed resolution in his life. After that, you simply walk down the ramp, into the helicopter, and go home. The credits roll, the achievements pop, and you have finished another playthrough. You may be a little bit upset at this point, having not gotten a chance to actually meet Delilah, but that really isn't the point of the story. Henry and Delilah aren't supposed to meet and fall in love and all that other business. Instead, the story is really more focused on the fact that you, the player, as Henry, have voluntarily come out to the Wyoming Rockies to try to escape pain, to try to provide some kind of respite from the things that are going on in his life. You both came here for something different, for something that isn't what you're used to. You came here for a much different kind of experience, didn't you? Maybe, unlike Henry, you didn't play this game to escape some kind of pain, but maybe to find something that strikes you in a way that the majority of gaming experiences don't. This isn't some kind of open world game with a ton of collectibles and achievements and quests, but rather a tightly knit story, a mystery, a bit of drama that compels you as the player to keep moving forward. Maybe along the way you find yourself being struck by one of the many emotional moments of the game. Maybe you found something within Henry to emotionally tie yourself to. Maybe you've had the same types of life experiences that he's had. In any case, this story will have made its mark on you in some way, shape, or form, be it positive, negative, or indifferent. My point with this is simply, The game very much mimics the wilderness it is depicting very well. You go out there and you come away with your own experience, not some kind of predestined path or planned emotional roller coaster. It affects everyone in different ways, much like Firewatch does. I've seen a lot of anger and hate towards the ending in this game, and really towards the story in general. People really do expect there to be some kind of grand design to the things that happen to you. They really do expect some kind of magnum opus that opens up to a giant reveal and massive climax to the story. This is not the case and was never meant to be the case. It is much more intimate than that. This is much more close to the heart, and anything that really deviates from that would take away from the kind of thing that Campo Santo is trying to do here. To wrap up, we'll bring it all the way back around. This is very much like that Spencer Tracy movie that I talked about earlier. Just a really well done story, a very compelling tale of mystery and the human condition. There are three types of narrative conflict in dramatic storytelling: man versus man, man versus nature, and man versus himself. All three are on display here and very well done. We have Henry versus Ned, although you don't know that for most of the game. It's man versus nature, Henry trying to negotiate all this rock climbing and hiking, when really Henry isn't in his 20s anymore and really isn't all that fit for all this stuff. And finally, you have man versus himself, which is probably the most obvious one here when you stop and look at how Henry got to this point. The ending does a really good job of wrapping up Henry's summer by the woman he has been crushing on tells you to stop trying to run from things, to go back home and be with your sick wife. He then realizes Delilah was right, boards the chopper, and goes home to do exactly that. If you ask me, anyone who gets themselves all worked up and full of rage about this ending really needs to go back and check out Bad Day at Blackrock. You'll thank me. As far as how I felt about this game, Firewatch drew me in and kept me going until the very end. Not once did I think that the plot was lacking or the characters weak. It took me on my own emotional journey, plucking at very certain heartstrings. I felt like, in some ways, I could identify with Henry and Delilah both, granted from different ends of the spectrum. It left an imprint on me that was so palpable that I made this video talking about it. I didn't find the end as enraging as a lot of other people did. I wasn't expecting anything grandiose or spectacular, but just like a lot of other things in life, it just ends. Just like this video. Thank you very much for watching. Until then, everyone. Until then.